Yeah, this idea that if objective truth doesn't exist, then what are we doing when we're communicating? And then communicating becomes an act of manipulation.
Yep.
It's not me conveying something true to you that your mind can grasp and submit to.
Yep.
It's me trying to make you do the thing I want you to do.
Yeah.
And so that's when speech becomes violence.
Yeah. Which in itself is a nonsense term. Like,
Why? Why?
Speech cannot be violent. I mean,
Why?
because
It can hurt your feelings.
it can,
It can make you feel bad. It can
because
cause depression, perhaps.
it can.
So-
you know,
so
and,
why
and,
is it
and
not
speech is
violent?
powerful,
Yeah.
but actions define. Actions have to be the logical outcome of speech, right? So if actions become violent, one can say, well, your speech is inciting violence,
I see.
but speech itself cannot be violent. As soon as you've crossed that Rubicon, you start to move into the world that social media is in right now, which is this subjective, arbitrary decisions as to what can and cannot be said, right? And at some point, therefore, you are having to call, like, if speech is violence, then somebody has to regulate speech, and then who regulates speech, right? And this is where every totalitarian government in the world gets to, right? So, like, you know, your speech is, you know, kind of coming after the government in one form or another, so we're going to shut you down, right? You know, you're perceived to be an enemy of the national interest, right? And so therefore we're going to shut you down. And this is what the left is doing now with their allies in big tech, which is exactly where we've got to. You know, they've suddenly started drawing these arbitrary subjective lines as to who can say what and what can be said. And then, of course, at that point, you've kind of already lost, because you're going to get cancelled at some point. You're just going to get kicked off social media platforms. You're gonna be relegated to having to fight against a system, a Kafkaesque nightmare where you cannot understand the bureaucracy that has relegated you to being cancelled. This is what I mean, that the circle gets ever smaller. Like, you've already seen this on social media. You know, you've seen people on both the left and the right who have expressed opinions about whether it be vaccines or whether it be healthcare or whether it be racism or transgenderism, whatever it might be. All of these people have started to be cancelled, right? And so there are people on the left who have been cancelled. There are people on the right who have been cancelled. Naomi Klein, you know, she wrote The Shock Doctrine, talking about, like, how free market capitalism has effectively been hoisted onto the Western world. You know, she's a big anti-capitalist. She's also vehemently anti-vaccine. She was, you know, she was an advisor to Clinton's government. She was kicked off Twitter. She was banned permanently from Twitter. You know, obviously on the right, there's plenty of examples of people who have been kicked off. And that means that the social media businesses have effectively crossed that line. They have now started to believe that speech is violence, and therefore we must shut it down and we must control what speech can be said. And so you're already in that, like, paradigm reality where people are going to, you know, you're going to force people offline. And this is the very frightening thing, because this is actually the most frightening thing, and the left, or the kind of authoritarian big tech, don't understand this. And this is what frightens me the most, is because when you push people offline, when you push people into the world where they feel like they can't say what they want to say, it becomes the dark place from which bad ideas germinate, right? And that is, like, really terrifying, because then those bad ideas never get to see a good idea. And the only way you can defeat a bad idea is by showing it a good idea. Because if you just leave it to grow in the darkness, you know, dark things grow in the darkness. And so you then end up with this horrible world where, and I mean, you've kind of seen it in Germany, right? I mean, this is something which I've talked about before, which is, like, in Germany, Holocaust denial is illegal, which is nonsense. Why should the denial of an historical event be illegal? Now, of course, one could argue, well, there are lots of reasons in Germany why this is the case, you know, because of the sensitivity of the topic in the past. But as a result, you now have a huge section of German society that doesn't believe the Holocaust ever happened, right? So you've got millions of people in Germany who deny the Holocaust because Holocaust denial is illegal. And so this is...
And explain to me how you think that happens. So they're getting sort of shut out of public discourse, and then are they communicating with each other? Why is it that this thing is... How is it growing if the methods to communicate this false idea, namely the Holocaust never happened, denied them?
So, I mean, this is the inflection point between totalitarian governments and actual repression of people, right? I'm going to kind of try and break it out into like a triangle, or like three different sides of the argument. So basically, we live in the West, which allegedly makes this appeal to free speech as an organization. We haven't yet got to the point where people are literally being put in camps and taken away, like the Chinese Muslim population, right? Because we have said the wrong thing. We haven't got there yet.
Yep.
Right. Now, I would say there was a strong push towards people who did not get the vaccine to kind of be put into something which resembled something, and it was not pleasant to witness. We haven't yet got to the point where people are being taken away and put in camps. So, but what you have got on the flip side is you have got the totalitarian control of the mediums of communication. So you've already got the totalitarian control of mediums of communication in the form of big tech. You haven't yet got the government taking people away, and you have got illegal speech, right? You've got, like, take the Holocaust denial thing, right? You've got this illegal speech, you've got the means, you've got the control of communication, but you haven't got the kind of, in theory, the three normally move hand in hand. Totalitarian control, illegal speech, death, right? Like
camps, something,
right?
Yeah.
So you haven't got this third party, which means that people are still able to think what they want to think. And this is always where totalitarian governments fall down, because at the end of the day, you can only hoist a lie onto people for so long before, like, the innate, before God breaks through, or before the innate, like, freedom of the human mind knows that something is wrong. I mean, this is like every story about the decline of the Soviet Union talks about this, basically, where it was just nonsense, like making people believe fiction just the whole time. Like, we have to meet this quota. I've read plenty of books about the last 10 years of the Soviet Union, and it's always ridiculous. I mean, they're kind of entertaining if it wasn't, they would be entertaining stories if they weren't so sad in some ways, because, millions of people were dying of hunger and starvation, where these regional officials would just be set arbitrary quotas by the Kremlin, and then, they would just invent the numbers, and they just say, yeah, we've made 48,000 tons of wheat this year, when they'd only made like 3, right? And so the Kremlin would be like, great, we've got 48,000 tons of wheat coming from, the oblast of wherever, and then of course nothing like that would come, and then people would be short rationed, and then they would die of hunger over the winter, right? And this was happening the whole time. So it's to go back to the original point, like you've got this system now, but again, the Soviet Union, the totalitarian governments had absolute control. They had the means to execute people. They controlled illegal speech, and they had the control of the mediums of communication. We do not have that final
third
point.
side of the triangle.
And so as a result, you have people who are being kicked off forums online by controlled media. You have illegal things, like in the UK, this is happening as well. The police are turning up at people's houses to ask them why they're tweeting about transgender.
That's not happening.
Yep, that happens quite frequently now in the UK. But you don't have this kind of end goal.
What are you seeing here in the States? You've mentioned Germany with Holocaust denial, transgender talk, police show up.
Yeah.
What's
the States? So the big differentiator between the States and the rest of the world, and this is one thing that I pray it never changes. Hate speech laws, right? The very term hate speech is a nonsense, right?
Okay.
The very terminology of that is complete falsity, because it comes back to this idea that speech can be violent, which is a nonsense, right? You have to have the ability to speak freely. If you do not have the ability to speak freely, you will never get public discourse, right? You will always live in fear of speech repression, right? And so the US does not have hate speech laws.
But people will push back against that maybe and say, I'm not sure what you mean. I want to, but I don't fully understand, because speech can be hateful. Can't it?
Yeah, but you have to be able to offend people with your speech, right? Speech is naturally offensive. I don't like you, right? Like, your hair looks funny.
Yeah.
Like, your beard is stupid, right? Your jacket looks... I don't think any of these things.
Yeah, no.
Make that into a clip out of context.
Yeah, let's do that.
I don't like you. But the point being is that, like, okay, so none of those were really that offensive, but let's just say I don't like you because you're white, right? Okay, well, so now have I crossed the line? Like, I don't like you because you're straight. How we cross? Where does the line get drawn, right? And so speech, again, it comes back to this whole point. You have to have free speech. If you don't have free speech, somebody is setting the rules at where that free speech lines, right? I mean, this is one thing about Parler, right? It's like, you know, I've never made an editorial decision about the content on our platform. Never once have I made a decision, right? Because in my mind and the mind of all the management of the business, it's like the sliding scale is so far up here. You know, we have community guidelines. Every platform has to have community guidelines. We don't allow pornography. You know, we don't allow financial doxing. We don't allow, you know, like, there's like gore, you know, or excessive violence, right? But the amount of content on the platform that actually violates those rules is tiny, right? There's plenty of stuff we do allow that you would never get away with on Twitter, right? I mean, people go on there the whole time and post, you know, I mean, I get a selection of it, and it's pretty disgusting stuff, but like, they're allowed to say it. There's no law stopping them from saying it, and this is the point. If you start to regulate that and start to say, okay, you cannot say this, then where are those people going to go?
That's what I want to get to.
Yeah. They're going to go offline. They're going to find other mediums of communication. You haven't yet got that place where you're taking them away to camps and trying to re-indoctrinate them. So they're going to find other mediums of communication, other methodologies of communication. They're going to go into the dark places of the internet, and they're going to inculcate themselves unchallenged with a set of beliefs that you do not want them to believe, right?
Yes.
And that's like, and you know, that's actually why I fear the most for like, you know, I fear for Europe, because Europe has a bad history with extremism, and like Dominic Cummings, who I'm going to tangent here, but Dominic Cummings was one of the political advisors on the Brexit campaign, and he has a checkered reputation, let's put it like that. But one of the things that he said, which I really think is the most interesting thing, is that you cannot, like, you need to hear the music, basically, and you need to listen to what the music is saying. And the reason he was big pro-Brexit was because he was like, we need to give the people this voice. They are desperate to express themselves, and not just another general election of meaningless politicians on the soapbox, but a genuine political expression of how they want their country to be ruled, right? Because if we keep shutting them down and jamming them into the face of the globalists, then you're gonna end up with a revolution that is going to be far, far, far uglier than a quiet revolution of 17.4 million people voting to leave a transnational, you know, economic bloc, right? And that revolution that's going to come in 20 years' time is going to be blood, and it's going to be violent, and it's going to be painful, right? And you're kind of like, you know, I mean, again, you're seeing this in Europe already. Like, what's happened in Sweden? You know, like, thankfully, the Swedish people are now voting to express their discontent with the way the ruling government has allowed. They've you know, the Swedish Democrats are now one of the largest parties. They have taken a very strong opinion about the integration of 1 million economic migrants and alleged refugees from, you know, North Africa and Syria into a population of 13 million. Right, and you're taking 1 million people out of a population of 13 million people. You're obviously going to get societal disconnects, right? I mean, there's a huge differentiator between the cultural and religious beliefs of people from transcontinental, you know, like thousands of miles away, and Sweden, which is, you know, a relatively placid Nordic country in the north of Europe, with a climate which is substantially different from the one that these people are coming from. And what have you got now? You know, it's now bog standard for grenades to be going off in Malmo, which is a southern city of Sweden. It's now very, you know, like, it has one of the highest rape incidences in the whole of Europe now, Sweden. I mean, these are the kind of cultural problems that you will get if you just go, you know what, we're not going to have this debate, and we're just going to shut it down.
Wow.
Right? And so that, and then in the long run, this is where I'm going with this point, you will get a backlash which you cannot control. And that is going to be the most violent. And that's going to be the danger point. And that's what's scary. That's why you need free expression. Because if you shut people down for so long, eventually they will take to the streets in a way that you cannot control, right? Or that you cannot, it's not even about control. It's about allowing for people to say what they really think.
So then how do you have community guidelines and it not be shutting people down? I mean,
you slide the scale as much to one way as you can.
Thanks so much for watching. Please like if you liked, and if you loved, subscribe.